Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about 5 of the most valuable pieces of DLC content in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about Lord packs in this video, not race packs. So things like the Ogre Kingdoms DLC, Vampire Costume Kings are not going to be the focus of this video. Although one could argue one of the most valuable pieces of DLC content is obviously the Blood pack, right? Though that, memes aside, joking aside, there are some very significant DLC packs in this game that do make a pretty substantial difference for certain races, and that is precisely what I want to talk about in this video. So at number 5, we have the Beast and the Hunter DLC that came out for Warhammer 2 that added Marcus Wolfhart for the Empire and Nakai for the Lizardmen. But it's not Marcus Wolfhart or Nakai that actually matter in this discussion. Rather, it's some things that the Empire got added as part of this DLC. So, the Empire got Huntsman Generals as a Lord choice. Now, Huntsman Generals are not great Lords. Their combat ability is going to be pretty weak. The problem is that ranged Lords and Heroes do have a lot of issues being able to do any significant damage. It's an issue for Legendary Lords, it's an issue for Marcus himself, it's an issue for Leaf and R, and it's an issue for Heroes, like Heroes as well, ranged Heroes as well. So combat ability is going to be weak, but here's the thing with these guys. They do offer some pretty nice campaign benefits for their armies. So Huntsman General will have Survival Expert for campaign movement range. That's, of course, on top of the baseline campaign movement range, and they also give you Casualty Replenishment rate of 5% and Line of Sight. Then they also give you range for Huntsmen and Archers of 12%. And that is a good, decent amount of power. But it isn't necessarily the best choice, and you can do entire Imperial campaigns without using these, but it is a decent enough choice. But what this DLC adds that is so very important if you're playing any Imperial campaign, doesn't matter if you're France, Gelt, Volkbar, or Marcus Wolfhart, it adds the Archer unit. Actually, it adds 2 units. It adds Archers at tier 1, and it also adds Huntsmen at tier 3 from a barracks. Now, let's talk about Archers. Archers are the best early game unit for the Empire. And in fact, as a DLC unit, they're probably the most substantial DLC unit in the entire game. Not because they're strong, they're weak, but because they give you a recruitable unit from every single settlement. You don't need a barracks, you don't need anything like that, and you get a cost-effective unit that is still pretty decent. Now, crossbowmen will do better. They'll have bigger range. They'll have armor piercing, because archers do have weak armor piercing. They only have an armor piercing of 2. If we look at them, they only have 2 armor piercing. They're not particularly great. They don't have the best range. Crossbowmen have longer range as well. But crossbowmen do require you to get the tier 2 barracks, so you won't be able to get them instantly. And of course, cost is also going to factor, because archers are just cheaper to recruit. They're cheaper to maintain as well. Now, the upkeep cost here is higher because of supply lines, right? Affecting my upkeep over here. By the way, archers are going to be far more cost effective than crossbows. And early game, you can benefit a great deal from having a lot of these, because you're not necessarily dealing with a lot of units that have very high armor. Some, absolutely, there are some units that you will be dealing with, in particular if you're playing Karl Franz and you're going after Festus. But with exceptions like that, many units may have lower armor. And so getting a lot of archers is actually a better choice than getting a lot of crossbowmen until you can build up your economy. On top of that, this DLC also adds the Huntsman unit. Now, the Huntsman may actually be the best ranged unit of the Empire, at least in an effective manner. See, the problem right now, we do have Huntsman, we do have 2 choices for endgame ranged units for the Empire. We have Huntsman at any tier 3 barracks, and we also have handgunners. Now, the issue for handgunners is as follows. That basically they have the same kind of missile strength as Huntsmen, though they have 17 armor piercing. The majority of their damage is armor piercing, whereas the majority of a Huntsman damage is not armor piercing, it's base missile damage, so handgunner units should do better. The problem is gunpowder units right now are pretty terrible in Warhammer Free. And so in an actual army, Huntsmen end up being better. They have stock, so they're invisible. They have Vanguard deployment. They can fire while moving, which is pretty substantial, so you can kite enemies to death if you are using Huntsmen. So two pretty good range units. One very cost effective, another one potentially the best range unit that the Empire currently does have access. If you're playing an Imperial campaign, I would consider this DLC to be a must-have if you want to enjoy it. Like, the Empire has a lot of issues. This DLC makes playing an Imperial campaign far more bearable. Of course, the Empire also has another DLC pack, and this one affects the Empire and the Vampire counts, and that's the Grim the Grave. That adds Volkmar, that adds also some units, but more importantly adds Archlectors as recruitable lords, which are generally the best lord choice because of the way their abilities work. But you can live without Archlectors. Trying to do an Imperial campaign without archers, I would not go for it. At number 4, we have the King and the Warlord DLC that came out for Warhammer 1, affecting the dwarves and the greenskins. And both of them do get affected in some pretty important ways. So you do get 2 legendary lords. You get Belegar, and you get, for the greenskins, you get Skarsnik. Now, from my perspective, neither of them are actually worth playing for different reasons. Skarsnik, because he's pathetically weak. The only major benefit Skarsnik does get is that upkeep and recruitment cost. And of course, character experience is also still very, very substantial. But here's the problem. Skarsnik is the weakest legendary lord by far in terms of combat ability. His campaign bonuses are pretty crap. You do get that upkeep benefit, but his skill line is pretty weak. Like, with Skarsnik, you're really gaining some of the faction benefits, and even then, hero action cost is not significant. The unique building chain is pretty miserable, and not being able to recruit orc units is also something of a pretty big issue, because orc units can help out your roster in some very substantial ways, even if you are using a lot of goblins, and you should be using a lot of goblins regardless of legendary lord. So Skarsnik is not great. Belegar is far more powerful, but here's the thing. It's not worth playing his campaign, because you could gain a lot more in a Dwarven campaign if you're playing Thorgrim and you confederate Belegar. It's actually far more worth it from my perspective to do something along those lines. And Belegar is actually the best legendary lord for the AI to control of the dwarves. He's got the best survivability, whereas Thorgrim has really bad survivability. If you're playing a Belegar campaign, expect to be to end up fighting the exact same opponents that Thorgrim is fighting as well, with a far more exposed core territory than Thorgrim does have. So issues all around when it comes to that. But Belegar does have a lot of power. He has missile blocks chance of 20% for all his units. He can give artillery missile block chance. It is that ridiculous. He's got a significant melee benefit. He can do very well with any kind of army. He can do better with the Slayer army than the actual Slayer King. I've talked about this. But it's not the lords that are very substantial, though. If you're playing the dwarves, being able to confederate Belegar, get access to him, can be pretty good. Rather, with this DLC, it's the units. So on the Dwarven side, you get the Regiments of Renown. Many of the Regiments of Renown, or all of the Regiments of Renown for the Dwarves, are tied to this DLC. So that can be a pretty decent amount of power if you want it. On top of that, this DLC, the only paid DLC for the Dwarves, adds Rangers as units. Now, regular Rangers, not worth it, but Rangers with great weapons, or Bugman's Rangers in particular, very substantial. Bugman's Rangers, because they're all Rangers are invisible, but Bugman's Rangers have the ability to replenish HP via the liquid fortification ability, and they're invisible. They also have Vanguard deployment, and they have charge defense against large. They're really good range units, probably the best range unit in the entire Dwarven roster. I mean, they're not more substantial than Warlords, but because the fact they're invisible gives them a decent amount of power. That's the first thing, and you can pair them with a Feign that gives them Snipe. Now, Snipe, what does Snipe do? Well, Stock keeps units invisible, unless they're fighting. What Snipe does is allows range units to shoot while invisible and to stay invisible. It is a choice. You have to customize a feign to do it, but basically Bugman's Rangers can decimate entire armies while taking very little or no damage in return. That's a good amount of power over there, and certainly if you're going to play a Dwarf campaign, I consider this DLC a must-have as things currently stand. I mean, it's not like the core Dwarven roster is weak. It isn't, but this DLC is important. It also crucially because it adds the Rune Lords as a lore choice, and Rune Lords are generally going to be better in a lot of ways than Dwarven Lords, than the regular Lords for the Dwarves, which is your only choice if you don't have access to this DLC. So quite a lot of things for the Dwarves. But what's actually very substantial is what it also adds for the greenskins. Now, for the greenskins, there are obviously some units, all that kind of stuff, added the lore choice. Though it's not a particularly great lore choice, I would not necessarily use it, because I think the Goblin Great Shaman with the skill line is better than the Night Goblin War Boss. If I'm not mistaken about it, if I'm not getting things confused. But I think the Goblin Great Shaman gives you a melee attack benefit to Goblin units, whereas the Night Goblin War Boss doesn't. Could be the other way around, but either way. Not necessarily very substantial things in this DLC for the greenskins. With one huge exception, and that's the Nasty Skulkers. Now, I was very skeptical of the power of the Nasty Skulkers until I played with them in a Grom the Punch campaign. And you have to understand, these guys will tear through much higher tier units that are vastly more expensive. The reason they do so is a lot of the greenskin research early on targets goblins and vastly improves their combat ability. Then lords can vastly improve their combat ability even further through their skill line, through certain special skills, all that kind of good stuff. Now, here's the insane part about Nasty Skulkers. The vast majority of their damage is armor-piercing damage. So they do 24 damage. That's what weapon strength stands for. But 3/4 of that damage is armor-piercing by default. And it's actually even a bit more insane because they get the opportunistic murder ability when engaged in melee for 15 seconds with a 3-second cooldown that buffs that armor-piercing damage by that increases their armor-piercing damage by plus 40%. So these guys are able to do a staggering amount of damage because they're able to ignore armor. And they also have a really good amount of melee attack. Even by default, you increase it, of course, with opportunistic murder. Then they got Vanguard deployment, and they have stock. The stock helps them getting killed by ranged units because they have low armor. Well, it doesn't matter because ranged units are not going to see them until it's too late. And they're also a counter in a way to cavalry. It's not a perfect counter, but they are a counter. See, cavalry wants to charge, and even AI will try and cycle charge. Well, they get Smoke Bomb, which nullifies the effect of charging because it reduces the speed of enemies within range. So this ability can stop a Bretonnian cavalry charge dead in its tracks. Is a great deal of power, and these units will win against much higher tier units, especially cavalry that's failed in their cycle charge, which they can due to Smoke Bomb. This unit will then kill the cavalry in melee due to their high melee attack in particular. And in campaigns, you also get a good amount of melee defense, decent armor, and there's several things. There's research, lord skills, and scrap, and all of these affect these units in a very significant way. But these are cheap, very, very cheap units, cheap to recruit, cheap to maintain, and you only need a tier 2 barracks to do so. It's not quite on the level of mandatory that the archers are for the Empire, but they still add a great deal of power. Speaking about Greenskin DLC, by the way, another great one, the other DLC that they have, of course, is also very substantial, the Grom the Punch DLC. The reason that's so very substantial, and pretty much on an even level with this one, the reason that's so very substantial is because it adds a hero choice, the Giant River Troll Hag. Now, the Giant River Troll Hag, their combat ability is not great. Their magic is not particularly great until you get to things like Purple Sun. But what's so very substantial about them is that they add replenishment to an army. having a hero with replenishment is pretty substantial. Now, the Giant River Troll Hags come from the Warden and the Paunch DLC for Warhammer 2. That's the one that adds Elfarian, it adds Grom. Now, Grom and Elfarian, pretty good lords, pretty substantial lords. Grom, the best greenskin legendary lord, but it's really the Giant River Troll Hags. You can't do wrong with either greenskin DLC, that's really the point. The first one adds some very significant things for the dwarves. The second one adds a hero that gives you casualty replenishment, which is pretty important. At number 3, we have, of course, a Skaven DLC, the Shadow and the Blade. It also adds things for the Dark Elves, and Malice Darkblade as a great lord choice. Some units, masters as heroes, pretty decent enough when it comes down to it, to the Dark Elven side, but it's the Skaven side of the DLC that is very substantial. Of course, one could argue the Prophet and the Warlock DLC is more important. The problem with the Prophet and the Warlock DLC is that at the moment, as things currently stand in Warhammer 3, gunpowder units are pretty bad. And so Jezzails and Rattling Gunners, although very great units, they just don't work very well right now because their ability to actually fire in the first place is pretty limited. So I would argue right now the Prophet of the Warlock DLC, which was once considered essential, I would argue it's not so essential if you're playing a Skaven faction. I would still get it, it still adds certain things you do want, and you could play a Naked Claw campaign without using those kind of units, but at the moment it's not essential for Skaven. However, Snitch's DLC is pretty substantial and will give you a decent amount of power. Let me explain how that is. First off, you get some units. The most important of these units are the Poison Wind Mortars. These are a hell of an artillery unit. They don't have the same range as regular artillery pieces, but they will do a substantial amount of damage. Armor-piercing damage, explosive damage, and post-explosion damage because they're firing warp projectiles. Now, these are a relatively high tier unit. They're a tier 5 unit, if I'm not... no, they're a tier 4 unit over here from the Arsenal. So you can get them at tier 4. And although Plague Claws are pretty substantial, the problem with Plague Claws is, yeah, obviously they're vulnerable. And I find that when it comes to Poison Wind Mortars, that the AI has actually some difficult time dodging their kind of projectiles, more so than many other artillery pieces. Like the AI is master at dodging artillery pieces on higher difficulties, of course. So that's one benefit, but it's not the most substantial benefit by far. Now, Snitch, being a powerhouse of a legendary lore for the Skaven, obviously that's a benefit. But this DLC also adds the recruitable Master Assassin lore type. Now, Master Assassins are, without a doubt, the best lore types for Skaven. At least early on in a campaign. Later on, obviously, you can go with more variety. But early on, they are pretty powerful. The reason they're so powerful is because they're going to benefit the playstyle you want to go for at the moment if you're playing Skaven. And what's that playstyle? What's the best Skaven playstyle? Well, the best Skaven playstyle is to go and get the Hidden Lair, and through the Hidden Lair, get Assassin's Hideout, Den of Secrets. This will unlock the Assassin Hero. The Assassin Hero gives you replenishment. Heroes are replenishment, pretty powerful. You can get this at tier 1, and of course this will unlock Night Runners and Night Runners with slings. Now, the problem with Skaven is that a lot of their early game units are very low armor, they'll break very easily, low leadership, so you can actually have a lot of problems and a lot of fights. Well, the Night Runners, and then Gutter Runners, Death Runners, all that, do have the ability to go into a lot of battles and just kill the enemy long before they even reach them, and then win the fight in melee, once the enemy has been weakened enough. And the Assassin Lord, the Master Assassin Lord, will benefit that playstyle in a pretty substantial manner. So they have an ambush benefit, but more importantly, they get concealment bombs for Night Runners and Gutter Runners, the units that you want to use. And then it will also buff the missile strength for Night Runners and Gutter Runners by 10%. I mean, there are other pretty good lore choices if you're playing Skaven, but I would argue without a doubt early on in the campaign, Master Assassins are absolutely the way you want to go for any Skaven campaign at the moment. I mean, with the exception of Fraught, with whom you can go with monsters, but even then you'd still want to get the ability to recruit Night Runners, because you'd still want to get the structure to unlock the Assassin. Like, you want to use Assassin regardless, but they're available regardless. But Master Assassins do buff those Night Runners, they do buff those Gutter Runners by quite a bit. Making them hidden, giving them concealment, giving them 10% missile strength, it's all very substantial when you think about it. There are some substantial benefits, of course, for the other lore choices, the Warlords, the Graciers, the Warlock Masters. There's some substantial, huge amount of power. But I'd argue early on in any Skaven campaign at the moment, going to Master Assassins, which is part of this DLC, is pretty important. Now at number 2, we have the Twisted and the Twilight DLC, especially for the Wood Elves, though of course you do gain benefits for the Skaven as well. Packmasters, Frata, and Clean, and each race, both Wood Elves and Skaven, get a legendary hero. A special mutant Rat Ogre for the Skaven, a special caster for the Wood Elves, Ariel, one of the 2 racial leaders for the Wood Elves in the Lord. In fact, I would dare argue she should be a legendary lord, but regardless, you do get Ariel, as every Wood Elven legendary lord, I believe, or rather as Orion, potentially as Durfo. I'm not entirely sure because I don't own the baseline Wood Elves. I've never had a reason to. This is one of the great things about this DLC pack. It allows you to play the Wood Elves without having to buy the Wood Elves as a race, because the racial packs can be pretty expensive. This is a way to do it on cheap. It adds things for Skaven, and it gives you one of the stronger legendary lords that the Wood Elves have. In fact, the second strongest. And for the longest period of time, the Sisters of Twilight were the strongest legendary lord choice for the Wood Elves. But now with the recent changes to Orion, he is by far and away the most powerful legendary lord for the Wood Elves. But their benefits, of course, come from the Forge of Dave, the craftable items that they can get for free as long as they fight battles and get Lord Dave's favor. And furthermore, on top of just being able to access the Wood Elves as a whole through the Sisters of Twilight and being able to confederate other Wood Elven factions, you can get Durfu, you can get Orion, etc. But on top of all of that, you get a new playstyle to the Wood Elves beyond what already exists for them. So generally speaking, the Wood Elven playstyle is either focused on ranged units like Glade Guard, or focused on Treekin. I do have a Treekin army way over here. That's the general playstyle. Like, you have Treekin, Treemen, very powerful units, combined with Glade Guard, of course, in this particular army. Combination of that can work very well. But the Sisters of Twilight do make one more playstyle and make it incredibly powerful. And that's the Hawk Rider playstyle. You can still use, obviously, Scouts, Heroes, etc. But Hawk Riders under the Sisters of Twilight exclusively are incredibly powerful, because they get that value of Kurnos ability for all Hawk Rider units faction-wide. All their armies get 10% ammunition, very significant for the Wood Elves. But that value of Kurnos ability is a great deal of power. It does a lot of damage, and you're doing it with ranged flying units. On top of that, they get further benefits when it comes to that. So they get one more abilities for their own army, Vanguard deployment, and rather physical resistance and upkeep for flying units. Like, they basically make flying armies work far better than before, and they themselves can have a completely flying doomstack. I mean, there are obviously some downsides with relying purely on flying units, but all the same, is a great deal of power, and it creates entirely new playstyle on top of already what exists for the Wood Elves. You can still play the traditional Wood Elven armies, but you can also play the Sisters of Twilight, Hawk Rider, Doomstack, and it is pretty powerful in its own right. So that's what this DLC adds. It gives you access to the Wood Elves, gives you access to legendary heroes for if you're playing as Fraught, or if you're playing as the Sister of Twilight and Orion. Not sure about Durfo and Draika. Pretty sure Draika doesn't get Ariel, but I'm not sure about Durfo. But either way, you do get access to quite a few things. Lord choices as well, Packmaster for the Skaven. And for a Skaven, you also get that focus on monstrous units. And you can make monstrous armies work far better, and melee armies work far better for a Skaven using Fraught Done Clean. So there's a great deal of value in this particular DLC for both the Wood Elves and the Skaven. Not necessarily the best Skaven playstyle, but it still adds something to the race that is pretty good. Finally, at number 1, we have the Silence and the Fury DLC that affects Beastmen and affects Lizardmen, and adds 2 of the most powerful legendary lords for both of these races. Tarax is by far and away the most powerful legendary lord for the Beastmen, and for the Lizardmen, you get, if I scroll down all the way here, you get Oxyotl. Now, both Oxyotl, Tarax, really powerful legendary lords, with different playstyles than the norm, and that's what's pretty substantial here with this DLC. So Oxyotl, on the Lizardmen side of things, you get some pretty powerful ranged units that Oxyotl buffs through the roof on top of that. But they're skirmisher ranged units that can do a great deal of damage and gives Lizardmen more range combat power, which was something they were lacking. I mean, they're still not the greatest faction when it comes to range units, but having skirmisher range units is a great deal of power. And Oxyotl himself has an enormous amount of power on the campaign. He basically starts in the south and he has no real opposition except Kairos. So basically, as opposed to fighting 3 legendary lords, which or 4 or 5 or 6, which some factions and some legendary lords can be dealing with, the only opposition Oxyotl has is 1 legendary lord in the entirety of the Dreamcast Waste. And then he has a great deal of flexibility on the campaign map because he can teleport to do certain quests that give him substantial rewards. So Oxyotl, really powerful lord. Tarax. Tarax as well, very powerful lord for the Beastmen. So, the way the Beastmen work is that ever since the remake, when they take over a settlement, they can either raise a Hearthstone if they have a Hearthstone shard. I don't have it right now, so I don't want to raise any settlement with Tarax, but they can raise a settlement and put a Hearthstone shard instead. Those are your only settlements, or they can instead raise the settlement and get some movement points. Now, Tarax takes this up to 11 with his campaign mechanics. So what he does, he has Rampage, Harsh Rampage, Savage Rampage, Cataclysmic Rampage. You need to get 50 Rampage marks every single tier. You get some rewards. But what's very substantial, and this is exclusive to Tarax, this entire Rampage mechanic, is the momentum. So momentum dictates how long a rampage is sustained. So here I have 6 turns basically for this rampage. But once I get to tier 1 of a rampage, I can use the momentum to reset my movement point. So for instance over here, I've spent some momentum to basically reset the entirety of my movement point. And I can do this again and again and again for however long I can sustain that kind of momentum, and basically just keep going on the campaign map. Now, to be fair, over here I did spend a bit too much momentum, but you get the idea. You can keep going from battle to battle to battle. Now, you gain momentum when you fight a battle, so you use the momentum to go to a battle that gives you more momentum and keeps you going in a fairly significant way. Hell, there's even a way to reduce that by going with Stampede of the Chosen and just being able to conquer large portions of the map. So Tarax, Oxyotl, very powerful legendary lords. That adds a great deal of value to this DLC. In fact, I dare argue that both of them are the strongest legendary lords for their races. That's what you're getting with that. Tarax, really powerful melee combatant, Oxyotl, range combatant, sniper, ambusher, etc. Then, for this DLC, for the Beastmen, you get the Jabberslives and the Gorgons. So 2 powerful, monstrous units that they will have access to thanks to this DLC. So a great deal of power for the Beastmen in this. The best legendary lore for the Beastmen, and also access to the Beastmen if you don't own the race pack, because Beastmen are the most expensive race, if I'm not mistaken, in the entirety of Total War Warhammer. So getting this DLC will allow you to play them. Now there are some downsides, of course. Creative Assembly decided to be a bit annoying when it came down to it. So you can't get access to the other legendary lords of the Beastmen if you don't actually own the baseline pack. Do you need it? Do you need them? Not really. You're very powerful even without them. It would be nice though. But Creative Assembly basically said, oh, you don't own the Beastmen baseline race, you don't get access to Khazrak, Malagor, and Morgar. But you're not necessarily missing out on a lot. But this is a much cheaper way, adds quite a few things for the Lizardmen as well, and adds certain important things that are for the Beastmen, and gives you access to the Beastmen race for far cheaper. That's why this is number one. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you boys and girls next time.